Hello and welcome to today's webinar on optimizing risk workshops. My name is Dr. Sarah Gordon and I'm going to be your host for the next 45 minutes to an hour, where we'll explore some hints, tips, etc. with regards to how to really make our risk workshops as useful as they possibly can be. Now, for those of you who are new to this forum, you will see on the screen in front of you that there's the opportunity to ask questions. This is done due to through the ability to type into the questions area. Please feel free to do this at any point in time during the webinar. If I don't answer your questions during the actual formal session, I will attempt to answer them when we get towards the end of the session itself. So please feel free to ask those questions at any time. Hopefully all of you will be able to see a slide in front of you at the moment, which is called Optimising Risk Workshops. As you can see, that's my name there, Dr. Sarah Gordon, together with my email address as well. So again, please feel free to email me with any questions or advice that you would like to give to me at any point in time. So just to start with, who am I? As I mentioned, my name is Sarah. I'm a risk management expert. I'm formerly based in London. However, most people who know me will say that I spend the majority of my time in airports or traveling around the world, delivering risk workshops, such as some of those that I'm going to describe here today, but also designing and implementing risk management frameworks in a variety of different organisations, be they private companies, charities or governments around the world. I'm the managing director of Satala, which is a risk management consultancy, but when I'm really lucky, I get to work with the Institute of Risk Management, delivering training courses and webinars such as these. As you can see from the picture, I have spent quite a lot of my life working within the non-renewables sector. So this is me on a mine site in Western Africa, delivering a whole series of training sessions on behalf of the Institute of Risk Management. But getting down to business, what are we going to be looking at today? Well, we're going to cover four main different areas with regards to risk workshops. We're going to look at what does a good risk workshop look like? So what does good look like, rather than what some typical risk workshops can seem to be like, which are sometimes not the most exciting things for us. Secondly, we're going to go into planning and preparing for our risk workshop. So what do we need to do in advance of actually running the session itself? Then we're going to go into running the workshop. And finally, we're going to finish with following up and ensuring that our workshop actually instigates action rather than just ticks a box, which is sometimes the case when we are running these workshops. They're just there to tick a box because an auditor has asked us to do them. That's not very useful for anybody. Instead, we want to ensure that our workshop instigates action. So let's get started straight away. What does a good risk workshop look like? Well, it certainly does not look like this. You know that your workshop is not going very well if somebody has fallen asleep in the room. And actually, we're teed up for this kind of thing in the world of risk management, because I think that most people, when they're invited to a risk workshop, either don't want to come or expecting some hours of their life which may be incredibly boring. So people walk into the room with you expecting boredom rather than expecting excitement and interest and discussion and challenge. And it's up to us to make sure that these risk workshops are as exciting as possible. So a good risk workshop does not look like this. It also does not look like this. And those of you with eagle eyes will see that the main difference between the first slide and this second one is that there is an Excel spreadsheet projected onto our flip chart in this particular room. Now, I've sat through a number of risk workshops in my life where you walk into the room, you sit down, and the facilitator projects the risk register onto a screen in front of you and makes you sit there and watch them type into that spreadsheet or that piece of software for the next few hours. It is probably one of the most painful experiences, both for the participants as well as for the facilitator, because nobody likes to type in public. So typing into a risk register or a spreadsheet whilst projecting it onto a screen is not the way that we ideally do risk workshops. A, it is not very interesting for the participants. B, it encourages people just to say yes to make the workshop go as fast as possible, and certainly doesn't induce lots of challenge and discussion with regards to your risks. And C, it means that people don't want to come back next time either. So this is what bad looks like. If we try and say, well, what does good look like? Well, that's what I'm going to try and show you over the next hour or so. So risk workshops should be opportunities for those participants who attend the workshop to air what they feel could be risks and explore them objectively. A risk workshop is an opportunity for people to discuss things that they feel uncertain about and for them to not be judged with regards to putting those particular items on the table. As you will all know, there are a whole myriad of different tools and techniques that can be used to assess our risks, be it by identifying them, understanding them, or evaluating them, as well as going into the management space. So how do we actually change those risks? There's lots of different tools and techniques we can use, and different people can use them in different ways within these risk workshops. Personally, what I've found in these workshops is almost a case of using them almost as counselling sessions for people to be able to air concerns or potential opportunities that in other forums within the workplace or within life they feel unable to be able to make those suggestions. Now, whilst we don't want to turn these into counselling sessions and we need to keep them professional, they are examples of ways in which we can actually air these different options for identifying those risks and deciding, okay, are these things that we actually want to manage as a team, or are they things that we want to tolerate or are happy tolerating? So therefore, these risk workshops should be forums for discussion and challenge that are actively looked forward to by those participants rather than dreaded, which can sometimes be the case. Now, moving into section 2, which is our planning and preparing for our risk workshop. It's very easy to think that if you're running a risk workshop, there's nothing more to it than just turning up on the day, opening up your laptop or whatever the case might be, and getting on with it. Well, what we found over a number of years is that actually the more preparation that you do prior to that risk workshop, the more successful it will be. It sounds incredibly simple, but it's amazing how often we forget to do the preparation that is really needed for this. This is especially important if we're doing a deep dive into a single risk area, or we're really trying to unpack something in a lot of detail. Making sure that we've got the right people in the room is absolutely critical if we're going to truly understand that risk and make sure that we can get to a decision point with regards to it. So depending on the nature of the workshop that you're trying to run will determine the level of planning and preparation that you need to put into it as a whole. Now, with regards to this, of course, there are different ratios we can use here, but if your meeting is going to be lasting an hour, obviously you want a 3-to-1 ratio with regards to how much preparation needs to go into it as a whole. So you need that preparation into the meeting side. That's what you need. Then, of course, you need to make sure that there is good follow-up as well. So we need to make sure that the follow-up is also programmed into your timing so that you can make sure things are really delivered on, or where you've agreed on actions, you as the facilitator have time to be able to deliver on that as a whole. Now, what you'll see in front of you here is a very simple template that I've used quite a lot for planning different types of workshop. It just asks me a few questions that I need to answer as preparation to make sure that I really deliver on what that workshop really needs. Now, you'll see there are a number of different boxes here, from purpose, outcomes, context, data, attendees, how am I going to plan the workshop or how am I going to run it, and then finally logistics and equipment. I really suggest that people use something like this when you're planning your workshops. You don't have to use this exact one, it is just an example for you. Now, to work through this, what do we mean by these different boxes? Well, with regards to purpose, this is why are we actually running the workshop? What is the point of the workshop as a whole? Perhaps it's just a simple update to a department's risk register. Perhaps it is a deep dive into a specific risk area. perhaps it's some scenario analysis or something that is changing very quickly, which could have a big impact on your work or something that you're doing. There are lots of different reasons why we might run a risk workshop. This is a good area as well, if you've been requested to run a risk workshop, to make sure that the person who has requested you to do it actually agrees with you with regards to what the purpose is. There's nothing worse as well as being asked to run a risk workshop thinking that you've done a good job and then being told at the end that actually you missed the point and you didn't deliver on what was really desired or what was intended by the person who requested it of you. So making sure that you've got this purpose agreed with the person who's requested the risk workshop, if that's the case, is super important. Secondly, the outcomes. Now, this goes hand in hand with that purpose. So what do you need or want to get out of the workshop itself? Are there any deliverables that you would like as outputs from that particular workshop? And again, this could be an updated risk register. It could be all of the information that you need for your strategic risk reports, or it could be an updated action list for how are you going to further manage a risk that you as an organization currently feel is outside of your tolerated limits. So what sort of outcomes do you want to achieve? This is also important to share with the participants who are joining you in that risk workshop so that they also know what it is you're actually aiming at and what the reason is for them all being in the room with you. Something that you can also include in here are stretch targets. So you might have your primary outcomes, but you might also have stretch outcomes as well. So are there additional things that you would like to achieve by running this particular risk workshop? The third item in here is your context. Now, this is something which provides you with the space to articulate what is the background to perhaps the team who you'll be facilitating, any risks that have been identified in the past, any changes, etc., that have been experienced with regards to that particular area of risk. This is your research into that area before you run that particular risk workshop. What do you need to pull together? And it goes hand in hand with any data that you might like to collect. So these could be data sets, or they could be documents, they could be information from public bodies, they could be annual reports from competitor organizations, whatever you think might be relevant to pull together that helps you with your background research for that particular team or organization or department. Things here include, say, for example, you are running a risk workshop with the Human Resources Department. They will probably have a risk register that was updated the last time that they had a risk workshop. If you're lucky, they will have been keeping it live, and so you can review any changes since the last time that you saw them. But also as well, there will be changes potentially to employment law, or trends in how to recruit individuals, etc. So all of this kind of research are the type of things you want to pull together in the context and the data section so that you as the facilitator of your risk workshop can ask the most informed and insightful questions of your attendees, and so therefore really get to grips with what do you think the main risks are as a whole. So the left-hand side of this template here really begins to paint the picture as to why are you running the risk workshop, what do you hope to get out of it, and then any background context or data that you either as a facilitator would like to pull together, or perhaps you might want to share some of this information with the participants before you run the workshop to make sure that they're all on the same page as a time. You will also, on the right-hand side, want to start listing out who are the attendees. So who do you want to invite to that workshop? Now, sometimes you're provided with a list of attendees. Other times you have to go and find those individuals yourself. Now, typically, if you're running a risk workshop for a department or a team, those are the people who will be on the attendee list. If, however, you're running a cross-functional or a cross-departmental risk workshop, say, for example, on a specific risk area, this is something where you might need to think a little bit out of the box because you need to be able to pull together who do you think are going to be the best possible people to attend it. So, for example, say, for example, you have a large piece of machinery that is currently broken. You've been asked to facilitate a risk workshop on that piece of machinery to try and work out how you might be able to get it working again, or perhaps you need to decommission it for good. You will probably want to pull together everybody from the most senior manager on site, because they will be able to make the ultimate decision with regards to whether that piece of equipment has to be decommissioned or not. They're probably also the budget holder for that particular site, and so again, they can make that decision. But you will also need people like the manager for that particular piece of kit, the supervisor, the people who operate it on a usual basis, perhaps the equipment provider itself, so they may be external to your organization, and any other experts who you might be able to pull together. So it depends on the type of risk workshop, who you actually want in the room. In terms of maximum number of attendees, this can vary as well. Ideally, you don't really want more than 15 people in the room. Any more than that, and the workshop can progress quite slowly because there are just too many people who are having to listen to one another at the same time. There are some tricks of how to deal with workshops that do have more than 15 people that I'll come on to in a little bit. But of course, you can run a risk workshop just with yourself and one other person. Typically, this would be called a risk interview, but you can still employ similar techniques with regards to running a workshop as a whole. So that's the attendees. You'll see in the slightly darker grey box, the facilitator, the date and time of workshop, and the location of the workshop. This may feel silly to include in here, but again, the number of times where I have arrived at where I think a risk workshop is, only to find that it's been moved at the last moment due to room availability. So making sure that everybody knows exactly where the workshop is, plus the date and time, is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you're starting on the back foot. Then we have planning, or how are you going to run the risk workshop? And this is the case here where you might actually begin to unpack what are the different options for the different tools, techniques, etc., that you might want to use to run your risk workshop as a whole. As I've mentioned already, there are lots and lots of different options that we have here. And it's usual to have plans A, B, and C in your back pocket as a facilitator, depending on what sort of information and knowledge the attendees bring into the room. More on that later. And finally, we have down here the logistics and equipment. So what sort of printing or materials, for example, do you need to prepare prior to the risk workshop? So this template really allows you to depict how you would like to run that risk workshop. What do you need in order to be able to do it? And then what you can also do is get this signed off either by your manager or by the sponsor of the workshop as a whole, so that everybody agrees with the plan that you've got to run it. It depends on what sort of organization you're in, whether this is something that is going to be useful or not. So just to give you a very brief example of this, so what you can see here is a risk workshop, the purpose of which is to just to update the risk register for the maintenance team in your imaginary company. The outcomes from this particular workshop is that updated risk register, or certainly all the information for it. Also the collation of all information needed for the maintenance team's risk report, and any controls and associated actions needed to actually manage those risks being clearly defined and allocated to individuals in the hope that they might actually get done. So that's the purpose and the outcomes. You can see here we have some context in that this particular team, they last formally updated their risk register 3 months ago. However, they've recently had an increase in their scope of work, and they've been very lucky in that they've got more areas within the overarching facility to maintain, and also they're bringing new people into the team to help them do it. So they've had quite a big change in scope. And then finally as well, we've got in there who the senior manager of the team is. And so I can go and connect with them to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then we've got, in terms of the data side of things, what I would like to get hold of is the most recent risk register for them, an outline of the facilities looked after by the maintenance team. This is important not least because in my mind I'll be able to identify some potential risks, but also when I'm discussing this with the maintenance team, I can be using the right language for the different facilities that they may be looking after. And I'll be able to understand what they're actually saying when they are challenging one another or discussing certain aspects of their jobs. Also as well in there, any individuals within the team, remember not all of them might be invited to the particular workshop itself, and then any detail available with regards to the new area being brought into the scope of the maintenance team. Does it have a risk register that was looked after by the previous team? Does it have any significant problems or significant areas of risk that we should know about so that we can certainly bring them into our discussion? And you can see that also being represented as any typical risks with regards to that new area of scope. What I've also included here is that list of attendees and then also the details in the grey box with regards to where and when, etc., this workshop will take place. You'll notice that I haven't filled in the plan and also the logistics and equipment because this is something that I would typically do after I have had the purpose, outcomes, context and data signed off by the most senior person or the risk sponsor, which in this particular case is most likely Fred Barry, who is the manager for this area. So lots of different things that we can pull in here. As I've mentioned, don't feel that you have to use this particular template, but it's certainly something that my team and myself, we find very useful whenever we are planning for risk workshops with any type of organisation. Next, in terms of our preparation, this is some of the typical equipment that I travel with. As you can see here, we have lots of different types of pen, lots and lots of post-it notes. You can never have too many post-it notes. Masking tape is always useful, especially when you want to stick bits of flip chart paper, for example, to the walls or posters to the walls. It is typically better than blue tack, but feel free to use whatever you would like. Also, even if a venue says that they will be able to provide this equipment for you, I still suggest that you take your own because it invariably won't all be there. And yes, you can always do with backup. So running the risk workshop, what do we need to think about here? Well, firstly, as the facilitator, in your own mindset, you need to be thinking to yourself that risk workshops are some of the most exciting things in the world. If you think that it's going to be boring, it will be boring because you will infect everybody in the room with your feelings. So therefore, you need to walk into that room thinking that it's going to be really exciting and entertaining and useful to everyone who has turned up. The venue, ideally, it is best to have the workshop away from the workplace. This means that people will potentially be less distracted. They shouldn't be able to sneak back to their computers and check their emails during any breaks that you might give them. And so you've actually got their concentration with you in the room. However, conversely to that, for some workshops, it might actually be better to have them in the heart of the workplace because then people can actually gesture to certain risks. So for example, the maintenance risk workshop, which I just spoke about here, it might be worthwhile having that actually within the maintenance department so that if necessary, you can actually go and visually look at certain key bits of equipment. Obviously, this will sometimes be dictated by the amount of time that you have available for that risk workshop. Some risk workshops, you only have an hour, and that's a case where you need to make most use of that time. It will probably be in the workplace. You probably will not give anybody a break during that 1 hour that you've got them for because there'll be so much to get through, and they should be able to go for an hour without a break. If, however, you have people available for 3 hours, then yes, you need to be scheduling in at least a short break for people to be able to step out of the room if they need to. But also as well, you might also be able to hold that risk workshop somewhere a little bit different to where they're used to being. You'll see that we've mentioned things like seating arrangements. Again, depending on the style of risk workshop that you're going for and the length of time that people are going to be with you, you may consider not to have any seats or tables in the room at all. And in fact, when I'm running a revision risk workshop, so that might be just a revision of a department's risk register or something like that, invariably we will spend the entire time standing and doing different activities. So whilst there may be some seats in the room for people who may be unable to stand for the duration of an hour, that's quite all right. For the majority of individuals, you'll be asking them to be on their feet and interacting in a very energetic manner, or as energetic as possible, throughout the course of that. If, however, your risk workshop is scheduled for 3 hours or more than that, then yes, you probably need to think about seating arrangements, etc., within that room. Now, there are many different styles for this. Personally, I prefer to go with lots of little tables, so you can have teams of between 4 and 6 crowded around those tables within the room. This is good, especially if you want to split people into different teams to take a look at different risks or to do comparing and contrasting of different risk prioritization. It also is much more collaborative as a style. Seating arrangements, which tend to be a bit more difficult with regards to risk workshops, are ones where you have people in a big horseshoe. That can be incredibly difficult because everybody is fairly isolated from one another, and it's also very difficult to move around the room. Similarly, a boardroom style can be quite difficult for a risk workshop, especially when you want to get people to stand up and work in different teams. It's just more difficult to get around the room. But as with everything, feel free to make use of whatever facilities you have, and I'm sure you'll all do a great job. Then we have activities, and so those are different techniques and tools that we can use, and I'll come on to those in a second. And then finally, the fourth bullet point there, we said, beware of personalities in the room. So this is something where invariably in any group of people, you will have people who are much happier to talk in public, and then you will have people who are quite scared or quite intimidating of speaking out loud and airing their thoughts. As a facilitator, it's your job to be able to ensure that those people who are happy talking have space to do that, but don't dominate the conversation. And also be able to bring into the conversation the quieter people. And that can either be through having a quiet conversation with them before the start of the workshop so that you make sure you bring their ideas into the room yourself, or perhaps running different activities or exercises so that those people who are quieter can air their thoughts and challenges in smaller groups rather than in the full group itself. This is something that is different for every group of people, and as a facilitator, you will become aware of these different personalities with the more risk workshops that you deliver. So with this, there are some typical roles that you would have for those people in the room. So to start with, you yourself are probably going to be that facilitator. Okay, so it's your job to make sure that this risk workshop is as successful as possible. Okay, you're there to keep the discussion on track and also ensure that everybody feels that they have the opportunity to participate in this particular risk workshop. As a facilitator, you need to stay out of the content, even if you have a huge amount of expertise and skill within the content that you're discussing. As a facilitator, you're there to ensure that all of the participants contribute as much as possible. You can add to the content at a later point in time, but it's very easy, if you do get involved in the content, to start to dominate it, and that is not what you want to do. So therefore, the rule of thumb is to try and stay out of the content as a whole. So that's you as a facilitator. Secondly, we will probably have a leader of some sort in the room, and that's potentially the most senior person. It may have been the person that asked you to facilitate the risk workshop in the first place. They may be the manager of the team. And as a result, again, depending on the style of your organization, they may feel that they want to say some words at the beginning of the risk workshop just to show that they sponsor it and they condone it happening, and that they would like their team to participate as much as possible. It's generally a good idea as a facilitator to have a conversation with this leader in advance of the risk workshop, just to align and make sure that they're happy with what it is that you're going to potentially be doing during the risk workshop, and also for you to ascertain how much input they as a leader would like to have. There's another reason as well for having a discussion with this leader up front, and that's because if in some organizations the leaders can be incredibly dominant, and just by having them in the room with the other individuals, everybody else stays quiet. If this is the case, the best thing that you can do is try and encourage that leader to step out of the room for a little while. You might ask them to go and find a piece of documentation, or maybe during that little conversation that you've had ahead of the workshop, you've given them a heads up that this can sometimes occur, and it's very, very normal. And perhaps they might like to find a phone call that they need to make, or another meeting that they just need to nip into, just to get them out of the room. This will then open up the floor for all of those other participants to speak a little bit more freely, because they don't have their boss in the room. If you can't get rid of the leader, or it is not diplomatic to do so, what you can do is split the workshop into lots of little sub-activities. So you split everybody into smaller teams of, say, 4 or 5 people working on different risk areas. What this then does is it means that the leader is only dominating one of your groups rather than the full group as a whole. And this means that sometimes you can have much freer conversation and better challenge between the remaining participants who are in the other groups. So I'm not saying that all leaders are like this, but it is very typical for this to happen in a variety of different organizations. So that's your leader. Then you have your participants, and this is, of course, the majority of people who are in the room, and it's their job to give input, ideas, opinions. They should be listening to one another. They will also be disagreeing with one another, but hopefully in some cases agreeing. And this is something where they will be providing the majority of the input to what the risks are, et cetera, that you need to be able to really begin to pull together during the risk workshop. Then you might have a scribe, and again, this is more or less common depending on where you are in the world. If you do have a scribe with you, they may well be somebody that you're training up to be a facilitator, so they might be part of your risk team. Or it's somebody within the organization that is getting exposure to a different part of the company, or an area that is perhaps more senior to which they've usually been working in. As a scribe, they also stay out of the content, and they're just there to record the ideas and the decisions of the group. They should not be editing anything with regards to what is determined. They should be, where possible, recording a very accurate summary of what is going on within that room. Sometimes I get asked if we can record risk workshops, be it using video or just audio. And this can be a good idea. However, it can make some participants feel incredibly uncomfortable if they think that they are being recorded. So it's up to you whether you think that this is a good idea for your risk workshop or not. Personally, I don't tend to record anything electronically. I will just be recording things in any risk workshops that I run using either a scribe, or I'll be recording it myself using my own notes. Finally, you may have a timekeeper in the room with you. Now, the timekeeper, again, depending on what country you're in, may be more or less usual. They can actually be, or this role can actually be something that is a really useful idea to give to a participant who you think is going to be a problem. So if you've got somebody who is part of that participant list who you don't think is going to engage very well during the risk workshop, then give them a job to do. And the simplest job that you can give someone is that of timekeeper. This just psychologically makes them feel more involved with the risk workshop. It also means that you, as a facilitator, you've almost elevated them a little bit onto a pedestal because you've given them a job. And that's sometimes all that they need to stop them being a problem or a distraction during the risk workshop itself. The number of problem participants who have been solved by giving them the timekeeper role in workshops that I've run recently is quite remarkable. So giving those problem individuals a job to do can be really, really useful. So those are the 5 different roles. Obviously, there may well be more roles than that, but those are the typical ones that you may well find in a risk workshop. Just going back into the facilitation skills, as I mentioned earlier on, as a facilitator, you are there just to guide people through the workshop and to provide them with challenging exercises, etc. to do. You are not part of the content. So if we depict this as a burger, you'll be able to see here that all of the participants are the exciting stuff in the middle, so be it the actual burger itself, or the lettuce or the tomato or the cheese or whatever else you might have in that particular burger. They are the exciting bits, and you are just that bread roll that is holding everything together. You should not get involved in that content. Otherwise, you can be a real distraction. And I should say that this has been pulled from a really good book, which is just a short guide to facilitating risk management. So if people would like to go and see that further, please feel free to go and have a look at it. As a facilitator, there's a huge number of skills that you can make use of whilst you're doing this. And these skills are things that we begin to explore a bit more in the face-to-face training course that the Institute of Risk Management runs. But one of these key skill sets is that of active listening. And what we mean by this is when you are facilitating, it's a bit like acting in a play. So you want to have your entire body facing the participants. Okay, so you don't really want to turn your back to them. And this is all about aiming your posture. Also, depending on the culture in which you are facilitating, in the UK, for example, it's considered polite to make eye contact with people. So if you're having a conversation with them or you're facilitating a discussion, then make eye contact with them. Obviously, this is not appropriate in some other cultures. So just be aware of that and be respectful. Also as well, controlling distractions. So this can be anything from mobile phones through to things going on outside of the room. You ideally want everybody's attention to be with you inside that room and on that risk workshop. And then the final bullet point that I've got there is that mindset of attention. And what we mean by this is that if you can feel the energy of the participants really beginning to slump in the room, then consider giving them a break. Even just a 5-minute break will allow people just to get some fresh air or wake up a little bit. If you feel that energy slide, it is up to you as a facilitator to do something about it. Also with this, at the end of your facilitation, so at the end of that risk workshop, you will feel really tired. And that's because the majority of the energy that's going into that room will be coming from you, especially at the beginning when people don't really want to go along to a risk workshop. So this is something here where you will feel your own energy levels going up and down. And if you need a break as a facilitator, then orchestrate things so that you can take one and again, just get away from the room, compose your own mindset and be able to go back into that room again so that you're pouring as much energy as possible into that room. The final little tip to share with you just here with regards to facilitating and active listening is the art of paraphrasing. So this is something that when somebody has suggested a risk to you, as the facilitator, what you can do is say something like, in other words, X, Y, Z, am I correct? So what you're doing there is you're parroting back to that particular individual, what did they actually say to you, okay, or what did they actually share with the room? This is especially important in the world of risk management because often people don't really know what it is that they're talking about, or they find it incredibly difficult to articulate. And it's your job as a facilitator to be able to give them a little bit more space in which to articulate their risks properly. So for example, if you're doing a brainstorming exercise, being able to say to people, okay, what do you think the main risk is with regards to maintenance of our area? Somebody might say something like, There is the potential that we will have intermittent power cuts, for example, in that particular part of the building. You as a facilitator could ask them a bit more about, okay, so what do you really mean by that? Or can you describe that in more detail? Or can you give me an example of when this has occurred recently, if it has occurred? Things like that really begin to get the conversation going with that individual who has been gracious enough to share with you a particular risk. So this is the art of both paraphrasing, but then also instigating discussion, and then further to that, challenge with regards to what are the risks that somebody is putting on the table. It's also a good technique to use if somebody introduces something that you feel is wrong or incorrect. Personally, I would never use the word no in a risk workshop, because people are still being brave enough to put something on the table. Instead, I'd ask someone to explain what they mean in a little bit more detail. And through that, you can open up the discussion to everybody else in the room and ask them, what do they think? Do they think that there are instances where this could be appropriate within their organization, etc., or in their team? And through this, it means that you never embarrass somebody by telling them that they are well and truly wrong. Instead, you're giving them the opportunity to explain in more detail what is really going on inside their heads, and so therefore what they really mean by what they're saying. And that's important in risk because, as I said, often we don't really know what those risks are until we discuss them in a bit more detail. So with this, what I've got here is a list of 4 different example risk workshops. Now, I'm not going to go through these here on this particular webinar, and instead be cheeky and use this as an advertising slot for the next face-to-face training course that we're running in the Institute of Risk Management on the 11th of January in 2019. As you can see, there's a discount that is there. What this training course includes are all of, what we have just covered in the webinar, plus a whole lot more, and specifically, how would we run certain risk workshops? Now, some of you have been great and started asking questions with regards to how would you pull together different departmental risk registers, etc. Could you use a risk workshop to do this? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. But also, if anybody else has any example risk workshops that you'd like me to explore and some questions, we'll get onto those in just a little bit. What the training course itself does is it runs through these 4 different types of risk workshops that you can see here, plus any other types of risk workshop that those who are taking part in the training session would like to go through as a whole. So those are some example risk workshops. Just though, to not cut this entirely short and to show you some of these in action, what we have here is going back to our plan. You can see that I've now filled in the how part of how we're going to run this risk workshop with our imaginary maintenance team. And you can see that there are 8 different steps that I'm including here. This is a workshop that could be run in an hour. It could also be run in 3 hours, just with more exercises, or ideally, of course, we'd have an entire day. You always want more time for your risk workshops than you're ever given. But those 8 steps include, number 1, setting the context and understanding any changes for and to the team. Now, to do this, I would probably get the manager to provide an opening. So I'd ask Mr. Fred Barry to give an overview as to what the maintenance team does and what kind of changes are going on as a whole. Now, whilst they all work together, they don't necessarily know everything in Fred's head. And so by getting him to set the context, A, means that it is their risk workshop, not your risk workshop as a facilitator. And it means that it is their context, and so therefore it's going to be their risks that they can then go on and manage. This also means that if there's anything that you as a facilitator have missed in your preparation, you will learn it very, very quickly during this initial setting of the context that's been given by the manager himself. Then secondly, we might go into brainstorming the risks. So this is a case where you say, okay, based on our context and the objectives that we're trying to achieve as our maintenance team, what do we think the risks are? Now, the way that I would do this in this particular risk workshop is I would start off with lots of blank sheets of paper up on the walls. I would use lots of post-it notes. I would ask everybody in the workshop itself to write down on one per post-it note the top 5 risks that they see that could impact on their ability to achieve their objectives as a team. Now, once I've said 5, if there's somebody in the room that can only think of 1, that's okay. If there's someone that needs to list out 10, that's also okay. It's just a guideline. I then collate these risks using one of many brainstorming techniques. I can share lots of different brainstorming techniques with you, but ideally what that does is it then means that you end up with different nodes of risk that you can then take forward into a prioritization tool or into the risk register, because many people will be articulating exactly the same risk when they're asked to list them out. At point 3, this is when I might compare those risks to their previous risk register. And someone has actually asked the question to say, should you actually bring in a library of risks into the room with you, or different categories of risk into the room with you? They are always a good idea, and they can really help spark people's imaginations. I wouldn't, however, give them to people immediately at the beginning of the risk workshop, because it can serve to bias people's ideas. And so therefore, I would only introduce that to the room after you've done your initial brainstorming of risks. So the order goes: establish the context and understand any changes that have gone on with regards to that particular team, do your initial identification of risks, and then compare what you've got on the wall to any categories or libraries or previous risk registers, just to ask yourself, is there anything that we have forgotten as a team? Then we can go into the prioritization of risks. And again, there are some very simple ways of doing this. At this point in time in a risk workshop, you don't necessarily need to do any calculations. Lots of companies have different forms of risk matrices, be it comparing impact against likelihoods. The danger with doing this too early is that everybody gets very stuck in debating whether a risk has a likelihood of a 4 or a 5. This isn't necessarily very helpful at this stage in a risk workshop. So instead, what I suggest you use are relative scales, or you just get those risks and you say, okay, which is the most important? And you map them out in a linear scale or something like that. You can calculate the likelihood and impact of these risks at a later time, but initially you need to be able to still be working out, are these the right risks for your particular team or organization? You can then start to unpack some of those risks, and you can use things like risk bow ties, root cause analysis, etc. There are a whole myriad of different techniques you can use here, all of which can be done on posters and post-it notes, etc. You don't need to open up a computer at all. And finally, end up with identifying controls and any key actions that might be needed to start to manage those risks as a whole. Now, with all of this, of course, there's a huge amount of detail that you can get into. But the key with this, especially when you're doing an initial risk workshop, you can use a simple flow like this one that you can see on the screen in front of you. Now, this is a risk management process that is super simple. It is, however, based on ISO 31000, which you will recognize. And this is the route that I tend to use for any risk workshop that I'm doing. I will always start with some form of context defining. I will then assess the risks using whichever tools I need to use. I'll then work out how are we going to manage these risks, and then any final metrics, etc., we might like to bring in as well. Now, you can use this for any form of risk workshop. So be it a risk appetite workshop, this might be something where actually you're quite advanced. And so you've already assessed the risks, you know which are the important ones, and you can go back and say, okay, given the context in which we're operating and the objectives we've set ourselves and our ability to manage those risks, is it possible to achieve those objectives or not? If the answer is not, then what is our appetite to actually manage them further, or what kind of tolerance levels are we willing to live with? And so therefore, what additional actions or controls might we want to put in place? for example, okay? Or we might want to, if we're at a very senior level, use our review and monitor risks box to start to really depict what, against our risk appetite that we've set for the organisation, where are we really operating at the moment, okay? So pulling in additional data sets that will help us there. Something else that we can do is, if you've got a really restricted time for your risk workshop, you can, in terms between the defining the context and objectives and assessing the risks, a really good tool you can use here is a risk survey. And a risk survey is something that can either be emailed out to people in advance, or you can use one of many different softwares that are out there. What I would do with regards to this survey, or sometimes they're called questionnaires, is to keep the questions to a minimum. So you want it to be something that if they don't have much time, they can complete it in 5 minutes. And so keep the questions to a minimum. Ideally, keep the questions free text, because then if they do have lots of time and they want to give you lots of information, they can. Also, it means as well, if you're keeping it free text, you're not biasing anybody as to the input that they're going to be giving to you. Now, by getting them to fill in a survey, it does a number of things. A, it reminds them that they've got a risk workshop that's happening, so it reminds them to show up. Secondly, if they're a slightly quieter individual, it means that you will be able to see what they've been thinking, and you as a facilitator can bring those thoughts into the room without that slightly quieter person having to do it. And thirdly, as well, it allows you to ascertain the level of maturity with regards to risk management that that group might have. So when you're asking them to identify what do they think are the biggest risks to their team, if they give you a whole load of issues or past events, then you know that perhaps they don't really understand what a risk is, and so you might need to give them a little bit of education at the beginning of that risk workshop as well. What it also does is allows you to pitch the level of the risk workshop at the right level, so you can use more or less complex tools to help you do that as a whole. So that type of thing, be it a survey or a questionnaire, can be very useful to you. Just with regards to this as well, if you use a simple process flow like this, it is hugely flexible. So it means that if during your risk workshop a brand new risk appears and you want to dive into it in more detail, you can do that without derailing the entire situation. So just moving on, in terms of room setup, so this is a picture of a risk workshop that I ran earlier this year, actually in Russia. What you can see is, so we have some smaller tables, so we had them all split up into groups of 5. There were actually 20 people in this risk workshop, so it was a little bit larger than is ideal, but it still worked. Lots of activities on the wall. You can see there's the context setting activity in the corner, and then some risk brainstorming, some risk understanding, and then risk prioritization, which is where the gentleman in the yellow jumper is pointing to at the moment. The great thing with this one is that this is where you get your participants doing all the work for you, so them doing the facilitation rather than you actually leading it. And you know that you've really won in a risk workshop when this occurs, because they are excited and they want to be leading this risk workshop with you gently shepherding them from the background. Also as well, you can have risk workshops where, as I mentioned, you end up with way too many people, okay? So what do you do when this occurs? Well, you can have additional stations set up. So you can see here, this is a risk workshop in a corporate office, and there are way too many people in this risk workshop for my liking. But what we did was we split everybody into 4 different groups. They were each given their activities, and then they had to constantly feed back into the central group. This kept energy high. It also meant that everybody had the opportunity to speak and debate things with one another. And as the main facilitator, I could walk around and make sure that everybody was having the right sort of conversations. So as a result, I would always have spare stations or spare setups, just in case we end up with too many people in that room. Finally, when you get to the end of that risk workshop, you might need to work out how we're going to share everything that we've discussed. So this is a workshop that, again, was run earlier on this year. And as you can see, the walls are covered in Post-it notes. This is not where each individual station was set up, but what we did with this room was we took each of the activities, we mapped them out, and we invited other people from the office to come in and see what the main team had actually done during their risk workshop. This particular organisation had just gone through a very large change. It was two organisations that had merged together, and so they were actually trying to instill a lot of trust and a lot of sharing between the two organisations. So by bringing the entire the entire workforce into this room, just during their coffee breaks, etc., meant that they could see what had been discussed by the more senior people in the organisation during their risk workshop, and also contribute to it as well. So we had an activity going where we said, what have we missed? And this was a really nice way to build on top of the original risk workshop that we had actually done. So you can also see in terms of the flow of the room, on the left-hand side, we have our context setting, then we have our risk brainstorming, so that's our risk identification, then we have our risk prioritization, and then we have our risk understanding and any actions coming through from that as well. And so that was a very, very good interactive way of building more trust within the organization through using risk workshops. So the final area, of course, that we need to think about is that follow-up, because there's no point in doing a risk workshop without actually making something come of it. So finally, you don't want to make them forget you. So it's all about communication. And this might include things like a thank you email, deliver on any actions or anything else that you promised, schedule the next risk workshop, and then, of course, feedback to your own boss as well. Now, you will probably have other things here, such as a risk report or an updated risk register that you may need to do, or perhaps you've agreed to help somebody within that group actually write their own risk register, or whatever the case might be. Make sure you have scheduled enough time in your diary to be able to do this. Personally, all of my energy generally goes into the actual workshop itself, and the last thing I want to do is deliver on all of the things on this list. But it's so important, because otherwise you won't have any future risk workshops to go into after this. So actions, again, you can use whatever sort of action form that you want, and make sure that you do schedule that time in your diary, because the follow-up can take much more time than actually the preparation or the meeting itself. So make sure you really do schedule that follow-up. So finally, in summary, and then what I'm going to do once we've finished is quickly answer some of those questions that I haven't managed to answer as we've been going through. In summary, your risk workshop should be fun. This is what people should look like, ideally at the end of your workshop. So they are, firstly, they are alive and energetic, smiling, happy, and asking you when the next workshop is going to be, because they've seen it as a useful exercise, as something that could really move their organization forwards. What's in it for you? Well, if you do this right, then actually it gives you an awesome opportunity to understand your organization better, improve your own presence and influencing skills so that you really understand more about that organization than most other people. It is a really good opportunity to teach other people in the organization about risk management and ensuring that they go away with a far greater awareness of how do we do risk management in our own organization, and what are the risks that we need to be managing in our own teams, what kind of controls might we own, etc. Also, it means that when we're having to present to more senior parts of the organisation, such as the board, we can do this based on really, really good information that we've been pulling out of those risk workshops. The more time spent with the participants discussing things, the more information you will get yourself as that facilitator. If you are spending the entire time talking yourself, you're not collecting information. So you want to spend as little time as possible discussing things. And that allows you to report to those more senior levels in the organisation, as well as external to the organisation, from a far more knowledgeable position than might otherwise be the case. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the slide deck that I wanted to take you through. You can see the IRM's training website over there. So if you'd like to sign up for any of the courses that the IRM run, please feel free to do so. Also as well, you can see my email address here, so feel free to email me or ask for any of the materials we've been through during the slide pack. Just very quickly to run through on the questions that have come through. So those of you who are still typing, feel free to hit submit on your questions. I've answered a question about running risk management questionnaires, etc. beforehand. So yes, really good idea to do that, especially if you don't have a lot of time, or especially if you'd like the participants to feel that they actually own the workshop as well. What you can do with a questionnaire is, if you've done your blank page brainstorming to get them to identify risks, and then you might want to inspire them with some more ideas, you can then show them some of the ideas that they gave to you during their questionnaire. And that makes them feel really good about themselves because you're bringing their suggestions into the room. So there are lots of ways in which you can use that. With regards to running a risk appetite workshop, loads of different ideas for doing this, and it depends primarily on how your organisation interprets risk appetite. If it is something that is mandatory within regulation, etc., this is typically something that you would do once you actually know what the risks are to your organisation, because then you can work out, okay, what are those different thresholds either side of those targets that you're trying to achieve. If you'd like any more information on running risk appetite workshops, feel free to email me, because they are something that are typically very bespoke to each organisation. Activities and interventions that you might recommend, or sorry, I might recommend to raise energy levels or get people to know each other. So if it's a room full of people, even if they know one another, I might not know them. Any kind of icebreaker is painful. There are very few cultures in which icebreakers are fun, but we all know that we have to do them. What I will typically do is I will bring in some coloured bits of card and some different coloured pens or stickers, etc. And I'll ask everybody to write their name on the card and then also draw a picture, a diagram, a poem, or an algorithm of the riskiest thing they might be doing in the near future. This can be quite painful for people, but actually it means that they get to share something with the rest of the room, either to do with work or home, that they consider to be risky. Now, you can then judge from that if people actually understand what risk management really is, and also where people's minds are at. Do they see risk as being both opportunity as well as threat? Do they wish they were at home? Are they someone who's quite funny? Whatever the case might be, those are different activities that you can use to get the room going. Now, in terms of interventions, lots and lots of different things here. Generally, what I would do is I split people into different groups and have them almost competing with one another to finish exercises. So, for example, when people are prioritizing risks, I would split them into teams of, say, 5 people each. So you might have 4 different teams in the room, and I'd say, okay, you've got a maximum of 7 minutes to prioritize all of your risks, but the first team to finish wins a prize, or something like that. It depends on your organisation what is more or less appropriate to that, but introducing an element of competition can get people going. Also as well, if you do this with people standing up, it means that they've just got more blood flowing around their bodies, and so they will also be awake, which is really good in terms of those energy levels. And then finally, if you constantly mix those groups up, then they get to know one another the whole time. So those are some just different hints and tips with regards to activities and interventions, etc. We've got more and more questions coming in, so I will continue to work through them, which is great. So okay, I've got a good question here, which is, we have a number of departmental risk registers which feed into one single risk register at corporate level. How would you recommend a workshop to review each of the departmental risk registers, and what would be a good review frequency? Okay, so in terms of this question here, this is very common to have different departmental risk registers, and one of the biggest problems that we face as risk managers is how do you link all of them together, and how do you make sure that the right risks are being escalated to the one at corporate level? What I would probably do here, actually, if I had to do it in a single risk workshop, is I would run that as a corporate level risk workshop. And I do my initial risk identification without anything else in the room. And I would just say, what do we think are the corporate level risks? I might then split everybody into teams and get them to go and have a look at each of those departmental risk registers, all still while sitting in the room, to pull out what they think was really pertinent. Now, that would be a very qualitative way of doing it. Of course, you could make this a bit more robust by introducing some quantitative approaches as well. But it would be a really nice, simple way of actually reviewing each of those departmental risk registers. Now, in terms of a good review frequency, this is something that is typically linked into whatever sort of scheduling or diary you have in your organization. Ideally, you have everything on a live basis. So every time a risk updates somewhere in the organization, that then filters through. And if it's something that's linked to a risk at corporate level, it will sort of ping through there, as it were. In reality, most companies are still using spreadsheets, etc., to run their risk registers. And so, of course, this doesn't quite work like that. And so ideally, you update your risk registers as regularly as possible. In lack of that, then every 6 months is probably what you want to do, depending on the size of your organization, or if there has been a really big change in the environment or the context in which your organization operates. So, for example, in the UK at the moment, we're all waiting for decisions to be made with regards to Brexit. And so I suspect that most British organisations are teed up to review their risk registers depending on what decisions are made with regards to Brexit. So I see lots and lots of risk updates happening here in the UK over the next little while. 2 more questions I'm going to address here. And if I don't get to your questions, my apologies, but feel free to email me. I've got a question which is, we will be running a series of workshops to develop new risk registers with teams that have never had one. In the past, we've kept attendees for this type of workshop limited to managers, so only 3 to 5 people. What might be the advantage to inviting more junior staff? Question mark. So if a department has never ever had a risk register before, I would certainly go and engage with people of all levels, both within that particular department, but also external to that department as well. And this is because different people will be, they will have different opinions with regards to what those risks might be. If you limit it only to managers, you will only get the manager's view. And so therefore, there will be a whole load of black swans, or those risks that are beyond our imagination, that could actually occur and surprise everybody. Now, you can either invite all of those different people into your risk workshop that you've got planned, or you could run a whole series of different little risk workshops. It's completely up to you. If your company is one where actually there isn't a problem with hierarchy or people not speaking up, then feel free to invite people both from the more junior staff and from external to your department as well, to get them in the room. And as I've mentioned, kind of 15 people is quite a good number, especially if you then split up people into different little teams to do exercises. This would also be really good just as a kind of a team building exercise between those more junior staff and the managers as a whole. And in fact, if you create the new risk register with only the managers, I would probably put a caveat on it to say that it was only created with the managers, which suggests that there are perhaps some risks that are missing. Just as by way of a final example of that, a piece of work that I've been doing with a large mining company over the last 5 months, the number of times that we've run risk workshops that has involved the frontline staff or the more junior staff, where the managers say, well, this is how we do things, and the junior staff turn around and say, no, it's not. That might be what the procedure says, but we actually do this. And just that alone coming through in a risk workshop has delivered huge value as a whole. So it works in some cultures, it doesn't really work in other cultures, completely up to you. And another question here, how how do you deal with skeptical people at the risk workshop who are trying to disturb the rest and undermine what you are doing as a risk facilitator? Yes, you always get these. There's always somebody there who thinks that it's going to be a complete waste of time. There's no real reason in doing it. They don't want to be there, and it's a waste of their time. Now, these individuals are people that, okay, you can approach them in a number of different ways. Firstly, make them feel like they are a huge part of the group. So ask them lots of questions and say, person X, what do you think about this? What have you found in your line of work with regards to this? If they're sitting there with their arms folded and not giving you helpful answers, then feel free to call a break, so just a 5-minute coffee break or whatever the case might be, and pull them to one side and say to them, how can we make this better for you? And that will probably shock them a little bit because they'll be unused to being called out, but you're doing it in a way that is not embarrassing to them. What you can then do is reiterate what are those agreed outcomes that you've agreed with the sponsor for that workshop, and just to say, look, this is what we're trying to achieve here. Do you have any, I'd really welcome any ideas that you have that will help us get to that point. And what you've done is you have bolstered their ego because you've made them feel more part of it. You've also reiterated what the primary outcomes are for this particular workshop. And you've also asserted your authority to say, this is what we're doing here. Please get on board with this because you're not helping things at the moment. And you've done that without saying any of that particular subtext. So skeptical people can be really, really difficult. Personally, I tend to view them as a bit of an exciting challenge. And if they can be the people that come up to you at the end of the workshop, shake your hand and say, thank you so much, that was excellent, then that's a really good day for me. So yes, they are difficult. If they're being really bad, then make sure you go into lots of little team exercises so that they are only disturbing one team and not the entire group as a whole. Finally, what I would say is just to address the final questions that have come through. Interdepartmental risk workshops are really good. If you have a small company, you can run one risk workshop for the entire organization and get everybody together because they will learn so much about one another's departments. That's really good. If boards are keen to see changes in risks or risk scores, etc., what I would do is I would change the way in which you're reporting risks to the board, and I would include more risks and then actions that have been taken against those risks or control effectiveness. So those of you who have been to any of my sessions that I run with the IRM will know that I really like using a slightly different risk matrix, which has risk impact along the x-axis and then action needed or control effectiveness up the y-axis. What this does is it prioritizes those really big risks in the top right-hand corner of your matrix as per usual, but then also puts focus on those risks that need action taken. So it moves it from the top right-hand corner down. And in that particular circumstance, you see much more change in the risk profile of the organization. Whereas if you're using impact against likelihood, it can, depending on how you're using your ratings, it can be fairly uncommon to see changes occurring. So hopefully that has answered a number of your questions. So finally, in the last few seconds, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. I really look forward to seeing some of you in January. I see from the questions that some of you have signed up already. That's absolutely brilliant. Don't feel that you have to sign up to a training session, but it'd be fantastic to see you there. If you have more questions for me, please feel free to email me at sarah@satala.com, or of course get in contact with the Institute of Risk Management and they can pass on your questions. Thank you very much and have a lovely day.